Hello folks, this is Geraths, and our focus today is drawing the back legs, starting out with structure, moving into simple forms, and into complex anatomical forms that will apply to the structure that's underneath it. So I have sped up the footage about 300%, but you can still see me knocking the structure in, kind of laying it out, measuring things out a little bit, but mostly getting the idea of the action and the swing and sway, which I do sort of slightly over-exaggerated first, just to make sure that I've got the gesture of the pose first before the structure. So you may notice that I've taken the anatomy of the figure, the skeleton, and changed it to my needs, simplified the form so I don't belabor my design. I'm changing the skeleton to meet my needs because what I'm going to do later is I'm going to put the form on top of it and attach the tendons into it. So I want simplified areas that I can look at and easily assess where to attach all of this stuff. So I think I got a pretty good idea of the balance, general proportions. Now I'm measuring and back checking it. Now, though I may not do this in a workshop, it may not be obvious, I'm certainly using this methodology to check the balance of the figure, where the different forms are located, sort of to assess the whole design rather than looking at it a bunch of individual pieces. Using this loose design process assures that the entire composition will work instead of it breaking into little pieces. Now I'm going to build up the pivot points like the kneecaps, right? And so I've thrown in this little diagram of the knee from several different directions, which you should really learn how to do because rarely are you going to get an absolute front, back, or side view. I'm applying that notch in the back of the kneecap because there's a big couple of tendons coming off the gastrocnemic muscle that's going to fit on the inside of that. If you look at the diagram on the left, you'll see the leg actually in motion running. This is actually one of the best little accents that you can remember. It's the idea of this forms in motion rather than being stagnant and stiff. Now we move on to the feet. Remember, the idea of this demo is the idea for quick sketching. So like in a workshop where you don't have a lot of time to sit there and render things out, so you break them down structurally and then you add the form to it. In my diagrams, you might notice that I'm putting theory to practice. So I'm adding the structure and in a sense the skin and the muscle together that builds a unified design and holds the whole thing together, and it's very believable at this point as well. In fact, it's almost like I'm building a sandal or putting slippers over the front of it with that blocky calcaneus bone in the back. Now we're going to slide back to our reference photo and start doing some measuring. Again, just using some straight lines rather than trying to get the curves of the muscles. It's good to use this simple methodology first. That way your figure doesn't get overly heavy. And that's one of the big problems that people do is they put large curves on very muscular models, not realizing that actually adds weight and heaviness to the model rather than muscular form. What I do is I use those pivot points like the hips, the trochanters, the kneecaps, the ankles, and I sort of attach my measurements to there and pull the lines up to the other forms, again, just to check the width to length ratios. That way I'm building on a really good solid design with the proportions being primary to make sure that everything's going to go as I add the ellipses, the general volumes, and then start to apply the gestural anatomy to the forms. You may notice I put those lines across. I'm measuring up the forms to check the width against the lengths before I pitch forward. I may not do that absolutely in a workshop, but I'm certainly eyeballing that and keeping that in mind as I put the drawing together. Now at this point in the drawing, I'm semi-secure about the proportions of figures, so I'm breaking down the outside contour line a little bit more. Not too much though, because what I want to do is I want to gesture in the forms on the inside and communicate with the outside contour line. I also add the ellipses again to keep those forms overlapping and keep myself organized. On the screen to the left appears a diagram that I put together of the general muscles of the legs, the hamstrings, the gastrocnemic muscles, and the glutes up in the hips. See that diagram I put up to the left, what I've done is I've actually changed the anatomical chart to something more to my needs. I've simplified things and in a sense made it more organic and a lot more understandable. You can see I'm adding the chart now and how detailed and perhaps confusing it is to use. You'll notice as I put it together, I keep the pencil moving very quickly, though this film is a bit sped up, but I gesture everything in, I make it organic. That way I can change it and move it, add and subtract to it, take the tendons, make them more lifelike, make the whole drawing more gestural. Perhaps you can see I'm taking those tendons and using them almost like rubber bands and stretching them into the kneecaps that I built earlier. That way, what happens is you get a tenseness in the kneecaps, and then you get a roundness and more form in the legs and in the hips and in where the gastrocnemic muscle is, the calf muscles. Come to the point now where what I'm going to do is I'm going to start to hit the core shadows a little bit more. Now again, that's the definition between where the light hits and the dark hits. And I'm not going to chase the shadow too much. I'm going to chase more sort of to show you where the planes break between the lit forms and the dark forms that are going away from the light. So I'm going to bring the pelvis in here so you can see the effects of the muscles on the hip and the line quality, where I build it up on the trochanter, sort of swing and sway through a little bit more, stretch some areas out, and you can see the weight underneath basically the butt cheeks and the glutes in there. I let the pencil go from short strokes to long strokes to accenting strokes right there at the corner where you can see where the light is especially hard on sharp edges. This keeps the rhythm of the drawing moving, keeps the eye moving throughout the composition. You can always accent things. You can see I turn the pencil around and sometimes accent an outside contour line, and they go right in next to it with the core shadow. Sometimes swinging very long and sometimes making very little short staccato lines, like over the tendons, perhaps a very sharp corner of the gastrocnemic muscle where it bends a little bit quicker. Not so much trying to copy the photograph, interpret it for my needs, and in a sense make it more lifelike. What you may not notice as I'm drawing into this and starting to get a little bit more on the obliterated sides and disappear is I'm still using those tubes as an organizational principle. Where I'm turning the corner is essentially where I laid those tubes down to make sure that I hitch that up together with the vertical muscle forms as well. So at this point I'm going to button my lip up a while and just draw. Now that I got a good rhythm built up, what I'm going to do is start to add a little bit of cross contour marks. Those marks should generally go around the figure and around the form, as in cross contour. And then I shift them down more on a diagonal, so what it does is it creates more of a tension and more of a dynamic in the strokes rather than just straight across. They're more just accents at this point. They're just there to kind of add to it, not overtake the design. When we get to the end of the video and you look at some of the drawings that I've added, you'll see there's a lot of cross-hatching in it. But this drawing's more about the structure and the process of putting it together rather than an end result. Ultimately, that technique or style will be built up to you by doing your research, looking at the way other artists doing, and again, sort of experiment in your own drawings. Bringing up a couple of diagrams at this point. One on the far left is my interpretation from a model and turning it into muscle form. The drawing in the middle is from an anatomical chart. And hopefully what you do is use the two of them and combine them into an organic, flowing, volumetric drawing. Bringing back the model reference now, you can see the interpretation of my drawing to what the model's structure is. It being a demonstration drawing, I punch the process a little bit on the hard side, so the edges perhaps are a little bit sharp and the structure's still in there. Our next model and pose, you can see that the pose is just about the same as the last one, but the forms are much softer and have much more of a rounded edge to them. Also, what I'm going to do in the process is shorten it up a bit. The drawing takes all of about 10 minutes. It's slightly sped up. And so what I'm doing is, again, simplifying it even more. I'm taking it perhaps into a workshop at this place or into a classroom. This is the way that I would put it together if I had a model in front of me and I only had a short gesture drawing to do. My main focus here is simplification. I'm just hinting, suggesting a lot of the things that we did in the last demo. Certainly not trying to overgo with the muscles. I'm trying to keep the lines a lot more sort of fluid and a lot more rhythmic. I'm trying to keep the hard edges off the outside contour. Even on the inside of the form, I'm going down to places like where it's mostly bone and tendon down in the feet. I'll go up to kneecaps a little bit more, probably up in the trochanter, which is up in the hip, and use those areas as sort of my landing point at this juncture of the drawing, just to keep everything organized. Now, there really isn't any heavy-duty muscle form in here, so I'm relying even more on those simple tubes to get my overlap set out, to get the idea where the outside contour line comes in, and where those interior forms, those inside core shadows, and forms affect the outside contour line as well. So I'm sort of setting up this kind of ballet between the two, not committing to one or the other, but see how one affects the other, and to make it a much more sort of sophisticated composition, and certainly a lot more to what the anatomy is doing rather than just trying to draw a shadow or a big heavy outside contour line on it. Some diagrams are appearing on the left, so you can see the idea between the chartness of it, the idea of a side view and a back view, and if you combine them together, that's what you're frequently going to get, is you're going to get a combination of the two as you draw any of these forms. You're going to have to cobble together many different views together for maybe just one pose. So it's best to keep a very sort of fluid and non-committal idea to this until you have everything kind of set together and have your design solved. So once again, I'm going to draw, and you can watch as the pencil moves over and makes accents and commits to some forms and some focal points. Now, I'm not going to obliterate my coarse shadows and my fluid line with shadow. That will come in another video later. But what I am doing is, again, adding that little bit of that cross-hatching to it. You can see the lines are a little bit softer than the last model. And I'm using more of the side of the pencil to get not such a hard edge. I want that flesh and that form to be a lot more on the rounded side. Okay, I'm going to draw now, looking for a balance in between the short cross-hatching lines, the outside contour line, and the inner form. Now I'm getting close to the end of the drawing. Now I'm promoting the overlapping, where the abductors come in, where the butt cheeks overlap, the leg a little bit, the overlap of the kneecap, and again, sort of jump on those last little elements that kind of pull a drawing together. A few quick little brush strokes take the eraser chunk off the back of it. Now there's a few last seconds to take a look and see how the forms flow together, the line quality mixes and matches and works rhythmically through the figure, and we move on to the next drawing. This last model we'll be using will hardly have any muscle form whatsoever and will be much larger, so there'll be big overlapping forms. But remember, those muscles and that bone is still on the inside of that, so the structure still stays very similar. There's a lot of little accent points you can see in the back of the knees where the tendons are, or the ankles where the Achilles tendons are, hip region where I'll be putting a pelvis on the inside of that form. There may be a lot more weight on this model as opposed to the first model that we had. That certainly doesn't mean that you forget the anatomy that's on the inside of there. You don't want your drawing to become ponderous. You do want to accent the mass and the volume that's there, but you want to make it sophisticated, so the overlaps and when anatomy shows up spices up the drawing and actually makes it a lot better and a lot more interesting to look at. Case in point, as I'm going back from the roundness of the gastrocnemic muscle and still pulling in those straight Achilles tendons into those angular ankle bones and then into the angular calcaneus bone in the foot, so I can play off the roundness maybe in her hips and her legs a little bit more. I'm about to add the iliac crest at the top of the hip and then go down to the lower portion of the pelvis, the hips, and then round those out. So the forms will look like they're actually hanging off of, in a sense, a drapery rod, just becoming round balloons, which is very unappealing and very unsophisticated. You want to add those forms so, again, they're attached to the bone, where they're attached to other forms, where the muscles are in play, even though, of course, there's a lot of weight on top of that. It's a very Rubenesque model, and what I'm doing with my line quality is sort of swinging and swaying from one side of the outside contour line to the other, sort of adding my weight using the side of the pencil, again coming down to the kneecaps, showing the tendons that are there, and showing a little bit of that tension where it is attaching to the rest of the form. Now I've got the design and the proportion set up. I'm swinging back and forth between those organizing tubes, those forms, and then overlapping, going in between the legs and taking one form, overlapping another one, looking at a kind of trapeze act where one is swinging back between the other. Get a lot more sort of interest out of that rather than just drawing a big black outline thinking that it's a heavy model, so therefore that's what you have to put on top of it. Time to get in there and draw a little bit and figure out what the heck I'm trying to do with this drawing. Now I'm far enough along where I'm going to bring the drawing of the last model in for comparison, so you can look back and forth as I keep working on the drawing on the left-hand side. If you look between the two, you'll see that the drawing on the right, the slightly thinner model, has much more vertical lines through it. It shows the idea of the stretch and perhaps a little less of the volume and more of the gesture in her. The drawing on the left accents the curves in the tube, as well as the overlapping volumes and weight. Okay, folks, I'm going to draw some more. One big concept or idea that I keep in mind as I'm doing this, and it's just about any model, whether it's very heavily muscled or weighty like this model is that my line kind of flows like water going down a river. Sometimes it's long, luxurious curves, and other times it's more of a staccato waterfall or cascade effect. But the lines all interconnect and flow together, one moving into the other sort of seamlessly and endlessly. I'm coming down in the last 30 seconds or so, again, what I'm doing is accenting corners, sort of accentuating some of the overlaps, some of the folds, reinforcing some of the outside contour line, but bringing both legs together as a whole composition. Back to photo reference now so you can make a comparison between the two. Now at the home stretch, what I'm doing is I'm going in now in those like softer sort of mid-tone areas. I'm building up a little bit more, giving them a little bit more curves, sort of accenting the three-dimensionality of them and the visual flow. In a few seconds, we'll lose our photo reference and we're pulling back to another comparison drawing. So see how this flows into the comparison against the other model. Now there's certain evidence of the process and the structure still in there, but there's a good comparison between the two. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video. There's other ones in the collection there. You can go back and take a look at them of different parts of the body and other subjects. And I threw a few of my own drawings here at the end so you can see it in practice. So I'd like to thank you a lot for showing up, and nice to see you. Goodbye.